Good evening. By the time T.S. Eliot made what is believed to be his first published recording here at Harvard 80 years ago in 1933, the two poems that he chose to record, The Hollow Man and Gerontian, were already 9 and 13 years old, respectively. And incidentally, by the time he recorded The Wasteland, the sequence was well over a decade old. At one of his Harvard readings, Eliot described the experience of reading his own older poems in this way. It's not as if it was written by someone else. That would be comparatively easy. But it seems to have been written by a young person with whom one is intimately and rather embarrassingly associated. And one isn't enough the same person to have the right to tamper with it. Eliot's career took place at a particularly audibly attuned moment in our culture, one in which voices had begun to be recorded, preserved, and broadcast over a heretofore unimaginable span of space through radio and time through archives such as ours. When Eliot returned to Harvard in 1947, he was curious to compare the two recordings of The Hollow Man and encouraged the group of undergrads who had gathered here to try to perceive the differences. The work he had published in more recent years, 4 quartets, was immersed in the sonic realm of resonances and echoes, not visions and revisions, but, quote, our concern was speech and words after speech. In wartime London, he had had the peculiar experience of recording and re-recording portions of the quartets as power outages wreaked havoc with the studio sessions. He later told audiences, I did learn a lot, and by the most painful means, through hearing my records back, about enunciation. And I think I read at any rate a little more clearly now than I did before I had to learn as much as I had to about my own speech. Here to further this exploration of Eliot's enunciation, especially as it intersects with his own recent research toward a critical edition of Eliot's work, is none other than Professor, or Sir, Christopher Ricks. Ricks is the Warren Professor of Humanities at Boston University and the author of such essential and pivotal texts as Inventions of the March Hare, T.S. Eliot and Prejudice, and Decisions and Revisions in T.S. Eliot. It is a great privilege to welcome Christopher Ricks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I want to start by reminding myself of some of the rudiments of these matters. The first, of course, is the ambiguity in the word read as to whether we mean utter it or not. It's lovely that the language wishes it not to be clear. If I ask a student to read something, do I mean that he or she is to utter it or to take it into the theatre of their head? In the same way, I think the language likes very much the fact that the present tense and the past tense are the same, read and read. It's very beautifully used by Hardy in one of his poems. It's excruciatingly beautifully used by Geoffrey Hill, who has to go into the phonetics of the different, give you the phonetic symbol, which will make it clear whether it's I read or I read this matter. The key question always for any uttering of a poem is whether the utterer is putting something in that was not really there or drawing something out that was really there. So that again and again, I think our relationship has to be, is this supplying something that was, I'm afraid, lacking in the poem or the work of literature, or is it educing something which it was empty of me not to have registered? So that in the case, for instance, of Tennyson reading The Charge of the Light Brigade, when you hear him say, not though the soldier knew someone had blundered, that emphasis on you is clearly right, it's thrillingly dramatic, it's indignation rising to something much better than your usual indignation, and it is wrong of us not to have registered that that is what the rhythm is. I don't at all feel that he is supplying something which the rhythm of his lines had failed to evince. I feel that he is vindicating the line, and it's a pity I missed it. That's the first rudiment for me. The second one would have to do with the difference between a critic and a scholar, because I want to talk about how listening to these recordings might affect the work of an editor, the editor being the scholar side of that, as it were, complementarity. The critic, I take it, is somebody who says that tells you that he or she may have noticed something that you may not have noticed. It's a relatively modest enterprise. It depends on tact, because you may already have noticed it, and it depends on tact because you may not believe it's really there for the noticing. But in some way it has to do not with the point of information, but with noticing something. The scholar, and I'm going to turn to editing, the scholar is somebody who puts it to you that he or she may know something that perhaps you didn't know. Now, these two concerns clearly overlap, but they can be differentiated. There is a difference between a critical point and the supplying of information, whether textual or contextual, of a kind that the scholar, in this case the editor, might wish to put before you. In other words, I'm committed in my practice as an editor, though there are important and valuable disagreements between editors about these matters, I'm committed to the idea that the note should never say, I have noticed things about this poem which you have not noticed. The format of an edition does not permit of any argument of a yes, but kind, or this is so, isn't it? The format doesn't permit of that. It has necessarily, from the seat of an editor, an ex cathedra side. So when Danny Carlin, in the Times Literary Supplement, very, very recently, indeed this month, Danny has a very fine piece about the editing of Browning, and he quotes the Ohio Baylor Browning. They say this: "We have attempted to hold interpretation to a minimum, although we realize that the act of selection itself is to some extent interpretive." And Carlin says, "The awful pitfalls that lie beneath these bland statements probably won't need pointing out to most readers who use scholarly editions." Now, there are pitfalls, but there are even graver pitfalls if you do not accept some such distinction. That is, a distinction between supplying a point of information. For instance, telling us that Lord Harvey didn't have any teeth and was famous for not having teeth, and therefore eternal smiles his emptiness betray, has a dimension which would not be there if you didn't. It's not just Tony Blair grinning away with more teeth than he knows what to do with. It's Lord Harvey, a similar figure, of course, in Pope's world. Now, that is a point of information, and it's not the same as having noticed something about the relationship between that line and, as well-bred spaniels civilly delight in mumbling of the game they dare not bite. At that point, you need the point of information to see why that, and half froth, half venom, spits himself abroad. The thing is held together by a piece of information. The poem has a coherence. To the question, do you need to know about Lord Harvey's toothless, the answer has to be no, because you never need to know any one thing about any work of art. That is, works of art have a way of supplying a very great deal, even in the absence of kinds of knowledge which are then a superb bonus. They're not the price of admission. But I think the distinction between an editorial enterprise which supplies information, that seems to me right of it, and the one which moves over into telling you there is something here which I think you have perhaps insufficiently appreciated. I want to remind you of some of the classic statements hereabouts. Here is Eliot to the Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, 3 years before he died. "With the publication of my own verse, I've always been firm on 3 points. First, I will not allow any artist to illustrate my poems. Second, I will not allow any academic critic, and there are plenty of these in America, only too willing, to provide notes of explanation to be published with my poems. Third, I will not allow any of my poems to be set to music, unless they seem to me lyrics in the proper sense of being suitable for singing. My objection to all 3 of these methods of employing my works is the same, that I should be allowing interpretation of the poem to be interposed between me and my readers. An artist providing the illustrations which should be left to the imagination of the reader. The commentator is providing information which stands between the reader and any immediate response of his sensibility. And the music also is a particular interpretation which is interposed between the reader and the author. I want my readers to get their impressions from the words alone and from nothing else. Now, as we all know, he did not actually act upon those principles. So I want to relate this to the kind of generosity which every now and then people have, which makes them override their own wise decisions and allow for exceptions, not to be trapped by their own rules. For instance, he does allow McKnight Corfer to illustrate the aerial poems. He does allow poems other than the lyrics to be set to music, Johnny Dankworth, for example, and he... what is the third? Yes, the third is the allowing of notes. He does allow notes, not only this, but he allows John Haywood to publish notes to the poems. It's true that they're published sort of in the world of Nordic noir, so they don't seem quite the same as if they were published in England, but that's how it works. And, of course, he utters the poems. Now, you could say that's not something standing between me and the reader, but it's clearly something which is interpreting the words of the poem as putting a particular pressure on us as to how we will in turn interpret them. So he is moved, and this again is well known as a statement of his, he's moved to say on the gramophone record in 1947, he's moved to say this. Excuse me. It was a leaflet that came with the record. It then went on to the sleeve of the record when it was reissued 10 years later. A recording of a poem read by its author is no more definitive an interpretation than a recording of a symphony conducted by the composer. The poem, if it is of any depth and complexity, will have meanings in it concealed from the author and should be capable of being read in many ways and with a variety of emotional emphases. A good poem, indeed, is one which even the most accomplished reading cannot exhaust. What the recording of a poem by its author can and should preserve is the way that poem sounded to the author when he had finished it. The disposition of lines on the page and the punctuation, which includes the absence of punctuation marks when they're omitted where the reader would expect them, can never give an exact notation of the author's metric. The chief value of the author's record, then, is as a guide to the rhythms. Another reader reciting the poem need not feel bound to reproduce these rhythms, but if he has studied the author's version, he can assure himself that he is departing from it deliberately and not from ignorance. It is, I think, a wonderful statement, including one of his finest parenthetical remarks, which includes the absence of punctuation marks when they're omitted where the reader would expect them. It's a great thing tucked up within there. It's characteristic of him always to use parentheses as simultaneously an aside and a crux, and it does itself, of course, depend upon the particular punctuation mark, which is the lunular or round bracket. So it's very, very powerfully used, as it is used by him in the poems. So there are these, acts of generosity when people override their principles. Samuel Beckett, because of his friendship for Jack McGowan, allowed the transposition of work from one medium to another, though in general he thought you shouldn't do that. Bob Dylan clearly knows that it doesn't make sense to print the lyrics of his songs because they are a multimedia art, but he also knows that we are grateful for them and it's a generous thing to do. Philip Larkin, on one occasion, very beautifully overrode his own rules in order to welcome a friend of mine. He wrote this: "Dear Christopher, thanks for your letter. It's true I generally decline." This was a friend of mine who hoped to meet Larkin in 1982. "It's true I generally decline, with such gentleness as I can muster, self-proposed visits by chaps like yours. But I suppose I can break my own rules, on condition that 1, you name your man and he isn't someone I detest. 2, it's understood that it isn't a precedent, but a single exception. 3, this is a private meeting and not an interview, very important this. 4, he realizes I'm seriously deaf and hard to talk to. 5, the meeting doesn't last more than an hour or 2. Then I should be willing to oblige you." So my friend duly receives great generosity from me. But again, it's where you have your own set of rules, but the right thing to do is on occasion to override them. A few last things. These are, for me, as I say, rudiments. That this is clearly related to the age-old argument about intention, because one of the reasons why we listen to somebody reading his or her work is if we are in dispute about what the intention at a certain point is. All the arguments about intention are real arguments. For Wimsatt and Beardsley, statements by authors of their intentions are inadmissible evidence. I think that's a wrong position for them to take, though it isn't, of course, a stupid position since they're highly intelligent. Tennyson, you may remember, has a note on the opening of The Lotus Eaters. Courage, he said, and pointed toward the land. This mounting wave will roll us shoreward soon. In the afternoon, they came unto a land in which it seemed always afternoon. So the first rhyme in this poem, in the Spenserian stanza, is not a rhyme at all. It's land rhyming, or rather not rhyming, with land, which is both the fullest rhyme you can have and the emptiest rhyme that you can have. Tennyson has a note, not originally published with the poem, I grant, but a note which says strand was the original reading, but the no rhyme of land and land seemed lazier. Now, it seems to me absurd to think that that's inadmissible evidence. You can say, as you can of any evidence, that it is not as strong as the evidence to be found on the other side, or it is actually false as evidence. But anybody who said that Tennyson, who uses the Spenserian stanza really only on this occasion, was not any good at it and didn't manage to come up with a rhyme, does have to explain Tennyson's own note, saying the no rhyme of land and land. In the afternoon they came unto a land in which it seemed always afternoon. Afternoon is doing the same kind of thing. Exceptionally beautiful, and I think perverse to say that, as it were, a comment by a friend of Tennyson's would be admissible, but Tennyson's own comment not. But these are important questions about intention, clearly. I'm not today going to say anything about the evidence, which is one important kind of evidence, as to Eliot's text. That is, I think editions have insufficiently incorporated the evidence of readings given by poets, or indeed by prose writers, as to exactly what the text should be at certain points, and Eliot does not always utter the very words that he printed for us. And the last point is simply about recorded sound itself, which I take to be, in its way, even more revolutionary than the invention of movable type. That is, that you could record sound was unprecedented. That is, you could transmit words. There were dozens of ways of transmitting words, including, as it were, in a fixed form. You simply could not hear again that symphony. You simply could not hear how that was said. So Edison's recordings of Tennyson, for instance, seem to me an absolutely extraordinary moment of a kind that even Marshall McLuhan can't sufficiently imagine the force of. Now, I'm going to start with matters of pronunciation, because they're where an editor might give you a point of information simply about how the poet chooses to pronounce a word. So if we could hear the opening of the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, I take it that it is at least a serious candidate for the most astonishing first poem ever in any first book of poems. If we have time for questions, I would love to hear rival candidates. The first poem in the first book of poems by a great poet, so assuredly and totally the master of his art. Really extraordinary. Thank you very much.
The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels, and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit.
The pronunciation I want to draw your attention to is the sounded T at the end of restaurants. The Oxford English Dictionary, in its first edition, gave you two permissible pronunciations. The not altogether correctly called second edition, gives you 3. The key question is whether to sound the T at the end or not. Eliot sounds the T in a way which sets the poem as more American than European, when that is from the beginning a real question for Eliot. I don't mean that Eliot is simply slavish about declining to be American or insisting on being European. The complexities of those matter rival Henry James's when it comes to the American and the Europeans. And if you think of what the sound is in these opening lines, the very first word has the terminal T, let. That terminal T is strongly marked against the opening at the end of the line, which is you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, 2 words which decline to terminate. I declines to terminate, it goes out into everything, the sky goes out into everything, we can't imagine it continuing forever or it's not doing so. So the first 2 lines have this very, very open ending to them, and then the sound throughout, let against patient, let streets, retreats, night, one night, sawdust restaurants, and you have to take care to sound the T. If you don't take care, it will be swallowed up. Streets that, argument, intent, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. That rhyme which he picks up from an Emerson poem which figures in the commentary now for the critical edition. So why does it matter how he pronounces it, and does it matter sufficiently to be worth noting as his pronunciation? Well, it matters because at first America wanted to pronounce it in the French manner. I think I probably still say restaurants, and when I asked my students this afternoon, though 2/3 of them sound the T, 1/3 of them don't. And it didn't seem to turn on whether or not they were from another country. That is, the pronunciations, the Oxford English Dictionary pronunciation, restaurant, gives as its phonetic sign nasal, and then gives you the French word franc, F-R-A-N-C, to indicate to you what the sound is at the end of restaurant. The first instance in the Oxford English Dictionary is Fenimore Cooper. A colleague of mine, Joe Rezek, pointed out to me this morning that was published simultaneously in New York, France, and London, but the Paris edition was where the particular deal was sealed for the publication of The Prairie. The most renowned of the Parisian restaurants, spelt without a T, A-N-S. So that clearly tells you that you hear it as a French word, though the French wouldn't have spelt it so. It's a relatively recent word for Cooper. The dictionary points out to you, let me see if I've got this right, that the use of the French restaurant in this sense is Paris in 1765. It doesn't go back very far into French history, but it's a tiny point of pronunciation. I don't think a great deal will be lost if there's no note telling you, but it is part of the tissue of the sound effects throughout that passage. Everything that turns upon streets, everything turns upon sawdust restaurants, and so on throughout the passage. So I am inclined, all of these things are up for negotiation because we have 2 editors, and my co-editor spends his time deploring my suggestions, and I spend my time deploring his. They take different forms. Mine are usually fancy and lexicographical, and his are usually biographical and come from his belief that anything about Vivian Eliot that he can possibly find should figure within apropos of any Eliot poem to which it connects. So some of these things are obvious enough. I take it that a critical edition needn't tell a reader that the word clerk is pronounced clerk, not clerk. So we move on from that. There are real class questions, though. It's important that Eliot pronounces the word often as though it did not have a T in it, and that's a very, very important class indicator within England. To sound the T is already to show that you are not altogether proper. He pronounces the word shone as shone, not as shone, as is one American custom. He knows about the nautical terms. He knows that it's leeward, not leeward. He hesitates as to whether windward would be windward or windward. So he's not quite sure. We have 2 readings, and in one of them he will do one the other. He helps us with names, of course. It's important to know that for him, whether correctly or not, it's Arjuna, the stress on the first syllable there. Phlebas, not phlebas, for instance, phlebas, and Phoenician, not Phoenician. These are, when you set these back into the passage, you will see the tissue of sounds, the auditory imagination, which is everywhere the condition of his art. It's a condition laid upon him and that he lays upon his listeners, readers. So that it's important, I think, to hear Phlebas the Phoenician, that sound continued, as against Volscian commission. Volscian commission continues that sound. Phlebas the Phoenician continues a different sound. So it has to do with the whole web and tissue that is the auditory imagination, about which he writes very beautifully and famously at the end of one of the essays in one of the lectures in the use of poetry and the use of criticism. Similarly, of course, it matters that he spells Michelangelo differently from how he pronounces it. He says Michelangelo, but he does not spell it as Michelangelo, with something of the tension as to whether you do or don't anglicize these names. My students think it affected and improper of me to say Don Quixote, though they have none of them any intention of pronouncing the word quixotic other than as quixotic. They apparently believe that the Spanish Empire was a better thing than I believe it to be, and in any case they don't take any note of the fact that in Cervantes' time it would not have been pronounced as though you were in range of a spittoon. It would have been much, much closer to the French Quixote. So that these questions of pronunciation have a lot to do with tribute or slight paid towards things that are foreign. Is it a slight to Michelangelo to turn him into Michael, or is it a tribute, as when we decided to pronounce it Paris rather than Paris, or to say Florence rather than to say, or indeed to come up with somebody called Titian? Which is not, we are supposed to say these things as would be wished by the natives of the land, except that both in cities and in names we don't do it. We say Titian, and I think we're right to do so because he has become an international property and accomplishment and astonishment in the way in which to insist upon an Italian form would be false. Eliot's pronunciations, I'll just say, he prefers always, not quite, I'm going to qualify it, he prefers instinctively a strong pronunciation. Porcelain, not porcelain. Porcelain in the immediate vicinity of marmalade. A strong sense of those words as going together. He says very, very clearly prelude, not prelude. Prelude, despite the fact that in Great Britain, as the dictionary says, prelude prevails. Perhaps we could hear Preludes 1. I can't bring myself to say prelude, but I know it's what he said. Please.
Now, I thought that for this particular occasion, I should like to begin by reading all four of my preludes, for the reason that they were written here in Cambridge. The winter evening settles down with smell of steaks in passageways. 6 o'clock, the burnt-out ends of smoky days. And now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet, and newspapers from vacant lots. The showers beat on broken blinds and chimney pots, and at the corner of the street, a lonely cab horse steams and stamps. And then the lighting of the lamps.
I'm inclined to have a note in an edition saying that for Eliot the word is pronounced prelude, again because of the tissue that then leads into in the poem itself. That is, if it were preludes, it would go differently into settle in the first line and smell in the second line and ends a couple of lines later. But the sound that comes to predominate is a rhyme or assonance upon the strong pre. Withered leaves about your feet. the showers beat at the corner of the street, the cab house steams. That's the sound which increasingly becomes the sound of the poem, and it seems to me, therefore, the question, of course, isn't whether or not Eliot has the right to pronounce it in one way rather than the other, though sometimes you can say of people that they are making a mistake in doing something, even a genius. That can be held, that can be maintained, provided you argue it rationally. But the question is the sound of the poem different? And it'll go back, of course, to the preludes or preludes in Portrait of a Lady. That is, prelude there makes a difference to the whole tissue thereabouts, and I think it's affected by the acute accent in prelude. That is, so many of these early poems are themselves so influenced by French or Romance moments as to give you, isn't that lovely, isn't that good? Thank you. So it matters to me, and again, how many of these can you find room? It matters for me that he says Saint Mary Waldoth, not as I would St. Mary, Saint Mary. That is, there's a feeling that something is strongly pronounced. Candelabra, not candelabra, which is what the spelling would ordinarily suggest to you. So that again and again, I think he's fascinated by, or will choose, the stronger sound. He's almost entirely an again man, not an again man, though he varies it when he wants to keep the dog far hence that friend to men, or with his nails he'll dig it up again. So at that point he rightly wants again, but ordinarily it's again, paces about her room again alone. It's quite different from paces about her room again alone. Again, alone. There's an obduracy in the strength of those vowels. He comes to it. Ash Wednesday, I suppose, is the most again poem of his, but Journey of the Magi, little getting. Beautiful moment in East Coker, again and again, going into gain nor loss. So what comes back again is the word again in a different form, which you will not have if what you hear is again and again, which in some ways is the more idiomatic form of it. So this again will be part of the providing of information, which has a critical purpose, but is not simply informationless. One recurrent thing in him is how to pronounce ate. That is, do you say the parched eviscerate soil, as in inanimate, or do you say the parched eviscerate? And again, he carefully judges these, and sometimes he keeps open the possibility that something is grammatically different from what you might have supposed. Terminate, torment. Not terminate, as in indeterminate, but terminate, torment, which is a permissible pronunciation of that form, but holds open the vowel and an urging as terminate does not. So all of those, staminate, pistolate, enervate, maculate, as against vertebrate, and those are in the immediate vicinity of one another. You couldn't, I think, deduce from the poem how you should say it, but it would seem to me foolish to spurn the information that says this is how the poet heard it and said it, even if you decide that it was wrong of him insufficiently to make it clear within the poem itself. And then you get into a perfectly principled critical argument about whether poems are the worse for withholding certain kinds of responsibility. The responsibility for the response is yours, and Eliot is not going to settle that for you, though it is then mildly perverse of him to read it for you, to utter it for you, even if he's then going to say, this is no more definitive than a work of music conducted by the composer. So that's part of the world there. Other instances, the spirit peregrine. I would have said peregrine, not peregrine, but it's absolutely clear that certain insistences come with that form of the word as it ceases, for instance, to be a name. Peregrine as a name has to be a short I. Peregrine is no such name, so you're helped in certain ways to understand it. I have more of these than I need. I care about testimony, not testimony. Testimony has a particular force in the wasteland, as matrimony has a particular force in East Coker. There's something about what happens when you lengthen the O in matrimony. You move it away from a certain kind of leniency, I think. He knew perfectly well that it should be called a Dahlia, as in Roald Dahl, if the flower, but at the same time he wanted Dahlia, partly because it had become the pronunciation, and partly because what it does with nightfall in the particular lines in which he speaks of the Dahlia, and night falling and the owl. So he wants the day to be there, kind of just glimpsed below the immediate surface of the line. Every now and then, a fact will rebuke a speculation. I wish that he said, alas, in The Hollow Men, because I had committed myself to the believing that lassitude is absolutely horribly the mood of the opening lines of The Hollow Men. But he does say, alas, and I will have to rescind the speculation that lassitude is part of the terrible downward feeling in those opening lines. We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men leaning together, headpiece filled with straw, alas, to different sound and so on. It's very important to him that he says cannot. He doesn't say cannot, he says cannot, cannot, on several occasions. Again, it would be a critical reservation that would say, might it not have been better if his rhythmical command had insisted upon that being the only pronunciation, except that he does not wish to insist. And there's a side of him that is very close to Keats' a negative capability, that is the ability to be in doubts, uncertainties, mysteries, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Plenitude is very strong because it abolishes the possibility of plenty. Keats needed to spell plenitude with two T's. For Keats, it was plentitude, which is absolutely wonderful joicing of what plenitude is. It is plenty and it is plenitude. Eliot's pronunciation, plenitude, I think this country has not decided whether it's a plenary session or a plenary session. I think it depends on the particular snobisme of the university. What does Harvard say? And then some of Eliot's pronunciations, for instance, I say desolation, but when I hear Eliot say the empty desolation, there is something about desolation that does seem to me to be very, very powerful and worth recording, even if you have to enter a caveat about whether it is audible from the lines themselves. I'd like now to listen, please, to the beginning of Garantian, and I'm going to say something about hard Gs. I'll remind you that he prefers Ganga to Ganges later. He's clear about the pronunciation of Journey of the Magi, when there are many ways of pronouncing M-A-G-I, all of them acceptable, and so on. But let's hear, please, the beginning of Garantian. Thank you.
Garantian, thou hast nor youth nor age, but as it were an after-dinner sleep, dreaming of both. Here I am, an old man in a dry month, being read to by a boy, waiting for rain. I was neither at the hot gates, nor fought in the warm rain, nor knee-deep in the salt marsh, heaving a cutlass bitten by flies fought. My house is a decayed house, and the Jew squats on the window-sill, the owner, spawned in some estaminet of Antwerp, blistered in Brussels, patched and peeled in London. The goat coughs at night in the field overhead. Rocks, moss, stone crop, iron, merds. The woman keeps the kitchen, makes tea, sneezes at evening, poking the peevish gutter. I, an old man, a dull head among windy spaces. Signs are taken for wonders. We would see a sign. The word within a word, unable to speak a word, swaddled with darkness. In the juvescence of the year came Christ the tiger.
Much of it is a play of the soft G against the hard G. He picks up from Tennyson a fascination with that. I'll quote Tennyson in a moment. Garantion, it's very important, is a hard G. It's important that it is not the sound that we are used to within the only such word that is much used, that is geriatric. That is, we have softened the G into geriatric. Eliot does not do that. His notes, there are many things that he said about the poem, and some of these, most of them will, of course, figure in our edition. For instance, he replies to a request from a young woman for help with her university entrance paper. I don't know what the university was. I still need to find that out. This is in 1945. The only thing I can say is that it is an attempt to build up an impression of old age, but the old age of a particular man about whom nothing further is known, looking back on his past. If the examiners think that is not enough, you can tell them that that is all I can say. So I don't see why you should say any more. I must find out what the university... He wrote very, very well to school children. There's a very good letter to somebody called Alice Quinn, who is not, I'm afraid, our Alice Quinn, but is a school child in England where he does some similar explaining. Critics assume, he writes to Shauna Phelan in 1944, any attempt to explain a poem is inevitably an ex post facto rationalization. It may certainly be what the poem means, so long as that is not what the author is supposed to have consciously meant when he wrote it. As far as that goes, it can only be said to have been the expression of a mood, its variations and associated or evoked memories, and so on. He wants, of course, Little Old Man. He wants the hard G, as is recommended by Fowler. He reviewed Fowler, Modern English Usage. He reviewed that in 1926, and Fowler recommends a hard G in Gerontocracy. He wants the Roman general Gerontius, where a Gerontian shares with his prototype the knowledge of past in action. That's from Grover Smith. And he wants Gerontius, and he wants Newman's dream of Gerontius. So all that is holding to the hard G. The draft title for the poem was Gerousia. At Sparta, the council of elders composed of the 2 kings and 28 other members over 60 years of age elected for life. As a judicial body, they heard cases involving death, exile, or disenfranchisement, and could even put the kings on trial. The hard G is, I think, doing a lot. And if you, again, I would want to suggest that the tissue of these opening lines is gates, goat, gutter, tiger. The soft G is not present except, strangely, in Jew, which is not a soft Jew, and in Juvescence, which picks up, is not soft G, picked up in Juvescence later. But there's something he's doing there which I suggest remembered what Tennyson was very beautifully able to do in the Lotus Eaters. There is sweet music here that softer falls than petals from blown roses on the grass, or night dews on still waters between walls of shadowy granite in a gleaming pass. Music that gentlier on the spirit lies than tired eyelids from tired eyes. Music that brings sweet sleep down from the blissful skies. Part of the move is the move from grass, granite, and gleaming into gentlier. And like Eliot, Tennyson loves the way in which something looks as if it should sound the same and then doesn't. Brown and blown in the same line look as though they should have the same sound, and then they don't. So this curious interplay of the eye and the ear when you read it and then hear it in your head. The most important soft G, I think, or hard G, is the more delicate algae and the sea anemone. There are so many ways of pronouncing A-L-G-A-E. It matters, and I think it matters sufficiently for a note, that for Eliot it is algae. The pools where it offers to our curiosity, the more delicate algae, and the sea anemone. It's simultaneously a couplet and a triplet. Curiosity is rhyming with anemone, but curiosity is also rhyming with algae. So that if you turn it into algae or algae, you've lost this way in which it's Trinitarian. It's one thing because it's a couplet. It's two things because it's 2 lines. It's 3 things because it has thrice the sound. Curiosity, algae, anemone. So it's very, very wonderful. And it's the first moment in the Dry South Ages when you've got a little line couplet that's like a pool. the pools, where it offers cheer to our curiosity, where he's remembering the sea anemone, which accepts or rejects a proffered morsel, is thereby relating an idea to the sea anemone's world. It's exceptional. It's the most beautiful moment in his Harvard dissertation, and it's the moment when you have to decide you're not going to be a philosopher, you're going to be a poet. To write that well in that mode means that you're now going to move away from writing doctoral philosophy and doing something else. So that's part of what is for me at issue in the perfectly simple question of whether we say Garantian or Gerontian, whether we accommodate it to our sense of old age, which is the geriatric, or the one which I think Eliot is putting forward. There are then effects of syllabication. His enunciation depends repeatedly on spelling out into the full number of syllables words which conversationally I think we elide. So secretary needs to have that many syllables. Councils is that expanded. Promontory, transitory, they're all given their full syllabication, and anything else I think would be a kind of compacting into the conversational. It's like Dylan singing, hanging in the balance of the reality of man, where reality has all its syllables spent out for you as if it's got an expanse which any kind of slurring or elision will abolish. I'd like us to listen now, please, to the end of The Hollow Men, and I'll quote one of the things one of the reasons why I think it might profit from a note, and this is Eliot giving advice to Michael Redgrave, who'd asked advice for a BBC reading of The Hollow Men in 1930. And this is what Eliot says. Referring to part 5 of The Hollow Men, the first and the last quatrain shall be spoken very rapidly, without punctuation, in a flat, monotonous voice, rather like children chanting a counting out game. The intermediate part, on the other hand, should be spoken slowly, also without too much expression, more like the recitation of a litany. Now, again, there are questions of the rights of an author to speak so to an actor, and Redgrave is a great actor, so the advice is not going to be wasted on him. But the thing I think that's particularly moving to me is rather like children chanting a counting out game. Now, the end of The Hollow Men is the huge counting out game that has to do with how the world will or might end. Thank you very much.
Here we go round the prickly pear, prickly pear, prickly pear. Here we go round the prickly pear at 5 o'clock in the morning. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow, for thine is the kingdom. Between the conception and the creation, between the emotion and the response, falls the shadow. Life is very long. Between the desire and the spasm, between the potency and the existence, between the essence and the descent, falls the shadow. For thine is the kingdom, for thine is, life is, for thine is this. This is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper.
I don't think editorial notes can describe how he says whimper at the end there. The extraordinary perfunctoriness of which is said over the shoulder at the end there. It's obdurately unsentimental and so on. The notes that Jim McHugh and I have are of very many kinds. They include a famously noticed thing, that is the presence of Kipling and Kipling's extraordinary use of the word whimper in Danny Diva and so on, a whole series of things. One of the questions that I would have, and I will wish to make time, please, to hear from people, has to do with the, I think, ambiguity of what not with a bang means. That is, I had not realized until getting to work on this that among the senses of not with a bang is the performance one, which is the program's carefully prepared and went off with a bang. Okay, American speech, show business slang, a turn is said to click when it proves to be successful, or in the vernacular, gets across with a bang. So at the end, you have this horrible feeling, is with a bang an explosion and destruction? I think the word bomb has a similar ambiguity in our two countries. That is, if something bombs, it fails, but a bomb is apparently something very thrilling and explosive, and everybody's very pleased about it. Do you know what I mean? So there's some discrepancy of the kind that lies behind words like sanction. William Safire, whenever in doubt as to what to write about, would write about words which have an antithetical sense. Like sanction, permits it or refuses it. Oversight, which means take care, is not neglected or neglected. All these words which are in Freud's world the antithetical sense of primal words. But I think there's something extraordinarily antithetical in not with a bang. That is that a vision of a certain kind of destruction? I want our notes to have far fewer references to atomic bombs. Eliot says things about atomic bombs, and he has an anxiety about the fate of the poem once the bomb has happened. One reason, would he still write his famous prophecy, he is asked. Mr. Eliot admits he would not. One reason is that while the association of the H-bomb is irrelevant to it, it would today come into everyone's mind. Another is he's not sure the world will end with either. You're in for something that's neither a bang nor a whimper. Just hold on there and find out what it will be. It'll be withering on the vine, some terrible thing of that kind. But I need to re-listen to these in order to see whether the reading gives one any help in whether or not one should adduce some of these ambiguities of phrasing. That is, there is a real ambiguity, it seems to me. And the next one, which is the end of Sweeney Aganistes, I want to have, and I'll come clean about it, I believe that this remembers the knocking at the gate in Macbeth. I won't give you, as it were, all the bits of evidence to make me think that. This is a great knocking scene and so on, and it's related to Eliot's earlier version of this, which was called The Superior Landlord and so on. But if we could hear the end of Sweeney Aganistes, and I'll just say something about my belief that Macbeth needs to be heard in some strange way off stage, but wondering whether or not Eliot's way of uttering it either makes that less or more plausible or is completely irrelevant to the suggestion. Thank you very much.
When you're alone in the middle of the night and you wake in a sweat and a hell of a fright, when you're alone in the middle of the bed and you wake like someone hit you on the head, had a cream of a nightmare dream and you got the hoo-haws coming to you. Hoo, hoo, hoo. You dream you wake up at 7 o'clock and it's foggy and it's damp, dawn is dark. You wait for a knock and the turning of a lock. You know the hangman's waiting for you, and perhaps you're alive, and perhaps you're dead. Ooh, ha, ha, ooh, ha, ha, ooh, ooh, ooh. Knock, 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 knock.
I'll give you some reasons why I think that the knocking at the gate is there. You'll remember, here's a knocking indeed. If a man were porter of hell gate, he should have old turning the key. Knock, 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 knock. Eliot, in a Shakespeare lecture, 1932-3, I have attempted a croquis, a rough draft of a play, Sweeney Aganistes, to indicate that our tragic feelings are best expressed not through tragedy, but through farce. So that's very important from very early on. That is his account of Marlowe, some of the things he says about Ben Jonson, that it's savage farce, it's tragic farce. This is what he's trying to catch, and what he's trying to catch in Sweeney Aganistes. Then, for a volume published in 1934, for to those who have experienced the full horror of life, tragedy is still inadequate. In the end, horror and laughter may be one, only when horror and laughter have become as horrible and laughable as they can be. There is potential comedy in Sophocles and potential tragedy in Aristophanes, and otherwise they will not be such good tragedians or comedians as they are. De Quincey's knocking on the gate in Macbeth is perhaps the best-known single piece of criticism of Shakespeare that has been written. So it's not just Macbeth, it is De Quincey on the knocking at the gate. It's a pivotal moment in romantic criticism of Shakespeare and understanding of Shakespeare. I would like advice as to whether anything in Eliot's way of reading goes to that. The reading is resolutely non-Shakespearean, but that's because Eliot believed that you could only really write successful plays if you broke entirely away from Shakespeare's way of writing. Sweeney Agonistes is one direction to go, as Coriolan is similarly that direction, and Geoffrey Hill, like F.R. Leavis, has lamented the fact that Eliot was not able to take either Coriolan, a complete Coriolan, or complete Sweeney, when those would have been the right ways to go, instead of into a certain kind of metaphysical and spiritual romantic comedy, as it were, like the plays, The Confidential Clerk and so on, or into four quartets. That is what happened. It is true that that road was not continuing to be taken by Eliot. If it's not Shakespearean, it's because there isn't any room for writing Shakespeareanly if you wish to get your play to mean anything. And I think Sweeney is the most performable of the plays. I mean, The Family Reunion is for me the most performable of the formal plays, the completed plays. But Sweeney is the one, and even in Eliot's own, as it were, amateur, not amateurish, but amateur rendering of it, there's a dramatic energy in it, which I think is unmistakable. So that would be part of that story. De Quincey, the De Quincey essay is absolutely wonderful, wonderful essay. It will be remembered that in the first of these murders, it's based on a real murder. And he says, you read about this murder, and you know that Shakespeare got it all completely right centuries before. The same incident of a knocking at the door soon after the work of extermination was complete did actually occur, which the genius of Shakespeare has invented. The world of ordinary life is suddenly arrested, laid asleep, tranced. The laid asleep goes into everything about dreams and nightmares in Sweeney Agonistes. The world of darkness passes away. The knocking at the gate is heard, and it makes known audibly that the reaction has commenced, the human has made its reflux upon the fiendish, the pulses of life are beginning to beat again, and the re-establishment of the goings-on of the world in which we live first makes us profoundly sensible of the awful parenthesis that had suspended them. Now, that essay clearly matters to Eliot, and I think it's necessary editorial comment on Sweeney Agonistes, but I'm not sure whether Eliot's own reading of it helps me. Now, I want to end, please, with our hearing. It's 4 minutes, a bit more than 4 minutes long, the whole of Triumphal March, Coriolan Triumphal March, and I'll be very brief on it, saying one or two things about it. Thank you very much.
Now, I want to read Triumphal March, but it's one of the most difficult of my poems for me or anyone else to read aloud. But for that reason, if for that reason only, I think one of those best worth trying to read. It is, of course, complete in itself, but it was to have been part of a much longer poem in which the character persisting throughout was a certain Cyril Parker. Triumphal March. Stone, bronze, stone, steel, stone, oak leaves, horses' heels over the paving, and the flags, and the trumpets, and so many eagles. How many? Count them, and such a press of people. We hardly knew ourselves that day, or knew the city. This is the way to the temple, and we so many crowding away, so many waiting. How many waiting? What did it matter on such a day? Are they coming? No, not yet. You can see some eagles, and hear the trumpets. Here they come. Is he coming? The natural wakeful life of Origo is a perceiving. We can wait with our stools and our sausages. What comes first? Can you see? Tell us. It is 5,800,000 rifles and carbines, 102,000 machine guns, 28,000 trench mortars, 53,000 field and heavy guns. I cannot tell how many projectiles, mines, and fuses, 13,000 airplanes, 24,000 airplane engines, 50,000 ammunition wagons, now 55,000 army wagons, 11,000 field kitchens, 1,150 field bakeries. What a time that took. Will it be he now? No, those are the golf club captains. These the scouts, and now the Société Gymnastique de Poissy, and now come the mayor and the liverymen. Look, there he is now, look. There is no interrogation in his eyes or in the hands quiet over the horse's neck, and the eyes watchful, waiting, perceiving, indifferent. Oh, hidden under the dove's wing, hidden in the turtle's breast, under the palm tree at noon, under the running water, at the still point of the turning world. Oh, hidden. Now they go up to the temple, then the sacrifice. Now come the virgins bearing urns, urns containing dust, dust, dust of dust, and now stone, bronze, stone, steel, stone, oak leaves, horses' heels over the paving. That is all we could see. But how many eagles and how many trumpets? And Easter Day, we didn't get to the country, so we took young Cyril to church, and they rang a bell, and he said right out loud, "Trumpets, don't throw away that sausage, it'll come in handy." He's artful. Please, will you give us a light? 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 Et les soldats faisaient l'ail, ils la faisaient.
It's a poem that almost everybody knows needs notes. It's wonderfully vigorously read, I think, by him. The key thing, of course, is to know that it's Ludendorff with all those armaments complaining at what the Treaty of Versailles had required Germany to throw away. It's Mussolini, it's the Rome March, it's many things of that kind, and it's Eliot's engagement with fascism much more satisfactorily than any of his prose engagements, I think, with it. Not that he was a fascist. He was soft on Salazar, which was a bad idea. He was soft on Charles Maurras, from whom the last lines come, and the soldiers form a row. They form a row. And that's the end of it. The move into French at the end is a reminder of the Great War, and the Great War is present all through, but then the Great War is not especially the site for Italy and so on. So it's an extraordinary, it is actually sort of postmodernist, I'm afraid, but that's just to say that the really good postmodernist things were done before postmodernism. That was not necessary to suppose that hitherto things had been such and such, had been unvexed by these matters. Now, the note I care about has to do with sausages. I could do a whole lecture on Eliot and sausages. They are very important. They're not important solely to him. They are, for instance, very important to Shelley in his account of Swellfoot the Tyrant, or Oedipus, of course, Swellfoot the Tyrant. Freeborn pigs regard with jealous eyes the failure of a foreign market for sausages, bristles, and blood puddings, state necessity, irreverent mockery of the genuflections inculcated by the archpriest. So there's a lot of Shelley's Swellfoot the Tyrant that's coming in through the sausages, and Eliot at the time has a rather striking letter where he writes to somebody about a huge public which is indifferent. You will have noticed the word indifferent within a triumphal march. A much smaller public which is hostile, and another public which is rejoiced when the Anglo-Catholic Congress takes place. And he describes the Anglo-Catholic Congress, talks about what it was, and then ends the letter by saying, I hope that I may take advantage of your hospitable sausages at 4 pence a pound before very long. Very, very strange letter. It's mostly about this public occasion in which religious and other kinds of conflicts and hostilities are coming together, and suddenly the move into sausages. But my main point about sausages, and here's where you perhaps wonder whether I'm altogether central in the things I'm talking about. The moment that says, quite wonderfully, 28,000 trench mortars. This is what the German army gave up needlessly and wrongly. And of course, Keynes is behind all of this because Eliot had the very, very greatest respect for economic consequences of the piece. He not only read it, he urged his mother to read it very soon after it came out. And he wrote an absolutely wonderful obituary of Keynes when Keynes died, which is repeatedly about how one would not have known that Keynes would ever become the statesman that he became. And statesman is, of course, the other half of the Coriolan story and so on. So there's no question that's important. What was a trench mortar? A trench mortar is a sausage gun. It is called that throughout the Great War. The letters are repeatedly about the sausages being lobbed into our trenches. It's a sausage gun. So perhaps the line, don't throw away that sausage, it'll come in handy, is horribly en route to the Second World War, which as a believer in Keynes's terrible prophecy, Eliot knew in the 30s was incipient. That is, you already had a book called, I think, The First World War, not long after the Great War, a title which was much deplored as prophesying that there would be a second one. Now, I'm going to listen again and again to this, hoping that I can pick up something which links the later sausage moment, but it is very, very striking. It's the oddest moment in Eliot, isn't it? Don't throw away that sausage. It'll come in handy. Now, of all the things that a sausage can come in handy is not the one that occurs to you, but don't throw away those trench mortars. They'll come in handy. Et les soldats faisaient la from the fascist, or all but fascist, Charles Maurras, 2 lines later. So that's part of my thinking in this. But let me hear from people, please. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Please. Sorry. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
I'm curious to know whether Eliot's pronunciation of languages other than English gave you any particular insight into poetry.
But it didn't, but that's just because I don't, it didn't, but that's because I don't have the tongues. I mean, that is, I have a little French, but my father became the Gallophobe almost immediately after marrying my French mother. I have read, I think Kenner is among the best people on the ways in which languages other than English work there. I take it you don't mean American. Well, when you're thinking about, I mean, those two. Do you have thoughts on it, please?
I don't really.
Sorry.
I was sort of just curious to know, because I don't know much about the history of sort of pronunciation of particularly dead languages, Latin and Greek, in terms of the significance,
yes,
literarily. So I was curious to know if there had been any insights in that area.
He spoke all the time as if he were much more ignorant than he had somehow conveyed to people. I mean, there's a vein of self-depreciation and deprecation in him, which I think is very unfortunate, and it leads him to say it's a purely subjective this and that. It's an insignificant grouse against the universe. These descriptions of the wasteland are wrong of him. They're kind of cadging, and it was very wrong of Valerie Eliot to use to give a whole page to that remark, reported, I think, truthfully, first of all, Theodore Spencer, Henry Eliot's brother, that it's purely it's personal, subjective, insignificant grouse against the universe. If the wasteland were that, it's not clear why we would need an edition of it with Ezra Pound's this and that. So I think, on the one hand, I think he wasn't as learned as it sometimes suited him to make out, because there was a side of him that liked to impress the fellows of All Souls, with whom he was good friends, Charles Monteith, but also Geoffrey Faber at that college. But I don't know. I mean, I'm very dependent on what other people have noticed. I have a son who is a classicist who helps me with some things, and Jim McHugh knows many people who help us with Italian, for instance. I take it that Dante is the most important. I can find my way around Laforgue and Laurent Taillade and Tristan Corbière and so on. I think I can do a sufficient justice, I mean, not a full justice, but a sufficient justice to their presence, especially in the early Eliot. And the move from Laforgue to Corbière is very, very important. I'm taking the excuse rather of your question. The only thing that looked like a conversation becoming a quarrel with Valerie Eliot was when she told me that she would not have the obscene poems, the Bolo poems, printed in Inventions of the March Hare. And I had decided that if they couldn't be printed, I wouldn't allow the edition to be published, because there was so much accusation of whitewashing against the Eliot estate, and moreover the move from Laforgue to Corbière, that is the move from Jamesian velleities to very, very coarse Breton explicitnesses, is a very important move from 1917 to 1920, when poems are not about drawing rooms but about brothels, and do you know what I mean? So, and the wasteland, of course. So that I was going to have to dig my little heels in, and then suddenly at dinner, Valerie Eliot had this wonderful moment when she came up with a formula which would help us both. She said, "It is true," and I knew I was all right then. As soon as somebody says it is true, you're going to be all right. "It is true that I did choose you to edit it, and so I should now accept that." And what that meant was that I would have been in error in choosing you, were you and I now to disagree very substantially. I didn't say I wasn't going to, but I would not have proceeded with publication of it. I think it would have been a terrible mistake. They were part of the notebook. They were no longer in the notebook because they went to Pound, but they're an integral part of the notebook and of Eliot's development. And if we're going to include drafts of the 1920 poems, which Valerie Eliot wanted me to do, I think rightly, although the volume is basically through to 17, then you've really got to include the Bolo poems. It's greatly to his credit that they're completely contemptible rubbish. I mean, he had no gift for these things at all. He couldn't bring himself to write a good obscene limerick. I mean, they're quite terrible. So that's, in a way, it's like Milton not being able to imagine the war in heaven. Good for you, John. It's not imaginable. Thank you. So, other question. Is that Lucian has a question?
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Do we have a sense of what Eliot sounded like when he wasn't reading poetry? I'm curious because did the people he spoke to and lived with, did they recognize sort of explicit attempts to change the way he spoke, or to speak differently depending on where he was living? And is that voice then in turn different than his poetry reading voice?
That's very good. I mean, I never met him. I can come back to that in a moment in the attempt to just tell you some anecdotes before I leave. But I've heard him give a lecture of amazing slowness and tedium. The subject is very, very good, but the feeling that every word is going to be uttered with kind of limpid, exorbitant gravity. Absolutely every word. You want to get on with it, and so on. Especially that rigmarole where he tells about, it's in the Christmas poem. There are several ways to talk about Christmas, and then you tell all the ones I'm not going to talk about. There's this way, there's that way. So he had a habit of beginning lectures in that way. I don't know what his conversation was like. Virginia Woolf is a witness to that, but is so spiteful that I don't know whether one should take any notice of what she says, really. I mean, she doesn't limit her spite to Eliot, of course. Ottilie Morrell receives a lot of it, and I think she was more spiteful probably about women than about men, by and large. But I don't know what recordings we've got of him at all conversationally. The BBC, as you know, did not keep an amazing body of work that they should have kept. I mean, that we don't have George Orwell's voice is simply astonishing. That we don't have Lawrence's voice is extraordinary, and so on. So there are those gaps. I don't really know. The anecdote is that he wanted to sue me, and there was a severe letter from a lawyer when I published something in the New Statesman, which said Mr. Eliot has taken the gravest exception to this, which clearly implies that he is a fascist, and so on. And I don't think he was a fascist, and my joke, which wasn't a bad joke, was an inaccurate joke and was therefore a bad joke. It went like this. I was reviewing a book about Wyndham Lewis, or a book that had something about Wyndham Lewis, and it said that the accusation, it referred to Wyndham Lewis as apparently favourable book on Hitler, which angered me because that book was not apparently favourable, it was unequivocally favourable. There's a later book which has reservations and is in some ways hostile to Hitler, but the original book's not apparently favourable, that's Weasel. It said the question of whether Wyndham Lewis was a fascist had been dealt with by T.S. Eliot. I said that Eliot could. I said this is a case of the pot calling the kettle white. It wasn't a bad joke, but it's not strictly true because I don't actually think Eliot was a fascist. I simply think he's not in a position to clear Wyndham Lewis. I mean, that is, there's enough of Eliot's association with fascism, with Maurras, and his support for Salazar, and so on, and various other things, that means he can't come as a character witness for Wyndham. But it was a severe letter in the New Statesman, and I had to choose between penury and honour, as so often in this life, and so on. So the New Statesman said, we regret, I haven't got it verbatim, we regret having printed words which Mr. Eliot has read as declaring he's a fascist. We don't believe he is a fascist, and I don't believe he is or ever was a fascist, but not, it would be a little bit like, I don't know, Haldeman clearing Ehrlichman of some accusation in Nixon's world. I mean, not a sufficient cordon sanitaire. But I don't know what he sounded like conversationally. There's a book which ought to be published, which is the journal of, and I hope I'm going to get this right, Mary Trevelyan, which Valerie Eliot was terrifically opposed to the publication of and did a deal basically with Mary Trevelyan about not publishing it. It's not altogether dependable, but she was in love, Mary Trevelyan was in love with Eliot and clearly supposed that Eliot would marry her. Eliot was disconcerted by his new secretary at Faber and Faber, Valerie Fletcher, who gives me the creeps. Now, he moves on, of course, to marry Valerie Fletcher, and when he tells Mary Trevelyan about it, it is totally the end of their relationship, as it was totally the end of his relationship with John Hayward. That the marriage broke that off. So there were two but her diary or her journal is full of very good anecdotal things where you hear his tone of voice in a sense, but it isn't an oral record. You hear him say things like, saw Bertrand Russell the other day, one of those successful failures. So that it's full of things of that kind and so on, and she likes setting these down and so on, but that's the best I can do. Please. Please. Thank you, David.
Oh, wonderful lecture.
It's very kind.
I was embarrassingly enlightened about so many things in Eliot that I thought I knew about. The thing that probably threw me most was the business about sausages, which is
good man,
utterly unlikely. And I was wondering whether not with a banger but a whimper might be a reading of that line.
Very good. Now, if I made that sort of pun, I would feel ashamed, but I'm very grateful to you.
I'm shameless.
Thank you very much. That's very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Christopher, I'm just blown away by the sensitivity of the acoustics that you're charting through this. When we had the T.S. Eliot Centennial, we took out some of these tapes and played them at Sanders Theatre. I don't know if you were there.
I was there, yeah.
Yeah. And many of us who were on the stage and doing the Centennial celebration actually were hearing, I was among them, his voice for the first time. And it struck us as extraordinarily pretentious and pompous, and no trace of a St. Louis accent or anything that would be like the Midwest, or his Americanism was completely obliterated, or very much so. But like anyone who acquires an accent, and he acquired an accent in your field of acoustics, which is rather exquisite to listen to every time. And so your sensitivities to the Britishness that he acquired strikes me as, could he not have been mispronouncing things as an American, pretending to have this transpontine accent? Frequently, he seems to just not know where his vowels are supposed to go in that big, pompous way of his. At least that's the way he struck many of us. So there's a kind of American piece potentially to be put in to the whole study.
You may well be right, and it would, I think what we want is a film in which he is played by Meryl Streep. Fresh from her success as Mrs. Thatcher's deciding to have a different voice, and not to be from Grantham, but to be in this strange sort of world which is sort of nowhere. It's the opposite of Ian Richardson in House of Cards, who is always somewhere in particular, and so on. I think what you call pompous, pretentious, and snobbish, and so on, is probably what I think of as English. Though I remember my friend Phyllis Rose was writing a life of Virginia Woolf some 15 or 20 years ago, and I remember saying it's very difficult for her to write about Woolf because Bloomsbury, they were all terrible snobs, and of course there isn't any snobbery in the United States of America. And I thought, well, Wesleyan actually isn't Cambridge, but can she not hear the purring from the greatest university in the world? I mean, London, Connecticut is not all that far away from here. I mean, the idea one could look at Harvard and say there's no such thing as snobbery. No, come now. But the accusation, as it were, that he's more English than the English, there is there's a benign side to that. You remember Malcolm Muggeridge saying that the only place you'll find really correct English now is in India. The now was 40 years ago, but the legacy of the Raj was that people spoke and wrote impeccably good English. It might have been stiff in certain respects, but they really knew the difference between like and as. They knew, and so we go through all these things. They knew the difference between mitigate and militate, which the dean of my university does not know. They knew the difference in flaunt and so on. Or that whole world of a kind of correctness, which went with social matter. But I think you may very well. I do hear him as there's a studied withdrawal from things which will clearly invite a certain sort of response. There is, if I go back to the idea of a cordon sanitaire earlier, that he keeps some sort of distance around him, which makes him not at all immediately accessible. It's the opposite of Frost's pretense to be immediately accessible. I mean, Frost was immediately a good friend of yours and so on. I mean, I remember the delight with which I met him, and he rose from his chair as if he were actually pleased to see me. But this sort of great rubbery fizz, all spent upon making you feel that you were at one with him, and so on. So there is something. It's more like Houseman. There is a very clear reserve which he parodies in How Unpleasant to know Mr. Eliot. I'm to meet Mr. Eliot. But I think you're right.
But I can't help but think about his contemporary Americans. Yeah. Who made a point of sounding American. I mean, of really picking up an idiom and a colloquialism and a broad accent that's actually American. Yeah. Whereas he clearly was changing himself. Yes. And I've heard this said about Beckett in Paris, by the way, that his French is not impeccable. Oh, really? And that the French can pick that up. Yeah. But people like me, who also learned French the way Beckett did, late or as a foreign language, don't notice.
Yeah.
And we tend to buy it
Yeah.
in a certain way that
Yeah.
buying his Englishness
Yeah.
without spotting
Yeah.
the glaring faults of a person making himself up to be other than he is, when his contemporaries are actually broadening what he's leaving behind. I think there has to be some acoustic echoes left. It's
I
just
think
a
that's
hunch.
very good and very true. I mean, but what's behind old Possum, after all? You pretend you're dead. What more convenient way to pretend you're dead than to pretend you're English? No, and he and Pound keep saying, everybody, you know, I don't like to be but he says, I don't like to be in Oxford because I'd rather not be dead. I'd rather not be around people who are dead most of the time. I mean, you know, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. I had not thought death had not done so many. It would have been different if it had been not London Bridge, but the Gare Saint-Lazare. I mean, that is, so there's a whole feeling about, what has happened to England, which he and Pound have in common. What you've got in America is a kind of empty galvanism. You know, you've got the Americans are all plugged into the electricity as in Psycho. So that's a quite different feeling, I think, about what's wrong with America, a frenetic life. The opening section of The Wasteland, which is often wrongly said to have been deleted by Pound, is deleted by Eliot, but it is, of course, the brothels and the bars of Boston. And if he had preserved that, it would have been a poem which began in the West and moved through the Mediterranean to the East. What happens is that it begins, as it were, in Europe, begins in England, and moves into more of Europe and moves to the East. But it did start with this very, very outspoken, and it began, of course, by referring to Tom and his wife at the time when the parents did not wish to speak to him because of who it was that Tom had married. So that was a huge change when he cut that out, and he had no precedent for a convincing voice. It's not well written. Now, you all know it, I think. It's a page and a half. It's a pub crawl, a brothel crawl. It's urinating in the street, committing a nuisance, the police coming and wanting to arrest you. You're then in cahoots with the police, so the officer doesn't do anything, and then you walk home. So that's that story. But it doesn't have an ear because there isn't anybody whose voice he trusts there. It's not Scott Fitzgerald. It's not. There's nobody who can help him do that. It would have changed the whole poem because the most important thing to the young Eliot is prohibition, because his grandfather had been the huge advocate of prohibition. The key thing about The Wasteland is that there couldn't be a pub scene in an American wasteland. That is, it's crucial that this is a European poem because you're allowed to drink. And of course, it runs right through from whatever it is it 1918, 1919? It runs right through to the year I'm born. It lasts for a very long time. It's given us a crop of pretty bad films and every now and then a good film. And there's a curious lack of memory of what it must have meant for it to be illegal to drink. Eliot's grandfather was terrifically in favour of prohibition and campaigned for it, and terrifically against any licensing of brothels. That is, any acknowledgement by the authorities that brothels existed or venereal disease, and that is what Eliot wants to write about. Ours is a nice house, ours is, and so on, goes through into Sweeney erect, and of course he deletes the page that is when the bridegroom smoothed his hair, there was blood upon the bed. He deletes that page, or he sends to his mother the American edition from which he's dropped that poem. He's very frightened of his mother, a wise move always. He is frightened of his father, but very, very differently. And his father is his father, you know, the letters by his father say that it'll be terrible if venereal disease, if there's ever found a cure, because it is God's judgment and punishment on people who behave badly. So that's something like I don't know why I've gone so much into that, but it is part of what you say. The Americanness for him, as it was in the original opening section of The Wasteland, was very, very violently criminal and diseased. That's what it is. It's thank you. I don't know, where did that come from? Please. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much.